The story known today as the Nazi Gold Train begins in the final months of the Second World War, when the German state was collapsing under the pressure of simultaneous Soviet and Allied advances. By early night, the eastern territories of the Lower Silesia, East Prussia, and Pomerania were experiencing rapid evacuation, chaotic military withdrawals, and the disappearance of vast quantities of state property. In this environment, German authorities began relocating assets considered vital to the regime: archives, industrial equipment, museum collections, and precious metals held by the Reichsbank. These transfers were documented in fragmented orders issued by regional Gauleiters, Wehrmacht transport commands, and SS administrative units. Among these movements was a reported armored train departing from Brest, loaded with valuables gathered from banks, administrative offices, and confiscated Jewish property. Contemporary sources indicate that by January 9, Silesia had become a transit zone for evacuations directed by Karl Heint, the Gauleiter of Lower Silesia. Soviet forces were approaching from the east, and authorities attempted to move material westward before encirclement. Railway manifests, although incomplete, describe several heavily guarded trains carrying chests of currency, bullion, artworks, and items seized during occupation operations. The chaotic conditions of the retreat meant that many transports disappeared, were destroyed by bombing, or were rerouted without record. It is within this context that the narrative of a specific gold train emerges. An armored consist, supposedly organized by SS personnel, to transport state holdings toward the south, where German leadership hoped to establish a defensive redoubt. The line most often cited in accounts is the route between Breslau and Waldenburg, continuing toward the Owl Mountains. This region was the center of the vast underground construction project known as Ries, administered by the SS organization overseeing forced labor complexes. The Ries works included tunnels, reinforced caverns, and partially completed subterranean chambers, intended for military command installations. Wartime documentation confirms that the area received large shipments of equipment and materials, yet precise inventories are absent. The combination of secrecy, underground construction, and rapid German withdrawal created an environment in which trains, once unloaded or abandoned, could vanish without clear trace. Reports from local Polish civilians after the war describe German railway units blocking tracks, restricting access, and conducting demolition operations along mountain tunnels in the final weeks of the conflict. Several testimonies mention an armored train entering the vicinity of Waldenburg and not emerging again, followed by explosions consistent with tunnel sealing charges. While these accounts cannot be independently verified in all details, they align with documented German tactics: destruction of infrastructure to slow the Soviet advance, concealment of sensitive materials, and the liquidation of forced labor sites before capture. Archival research conducted decades later uncovered partial references within Soviet military intelligence reports. These documents mention seized German transport lists, containing notes about evacuation trains, with valuables departing from Breslau in early 19. Soviet search teams operating in Lower Silesia after the war attempted to locate hidden depots, mines and tunnels believed to contain abandoned military stockpiles. Their findings: machine tools, documents, chemical materials, and scattered crates of personal property, demonstrate that numerous transports were indeed routed toward the region. None, however, explicitly confirm the existence of a single train dedicated solely to gold or precious metals. The disappearance of many wartime transports was facilitated by several factors. Railway junctions were repeatedly bombed, forcing trains to divert onto secondary lines. Fuel shortages caused long delays, during which retreating troops repurposed cars or unloaded cargo for field use. In numerous recorded cases, SS security units destroyed trains to prevent capture, using shaped charges or incendiaries placed inside wagons. Given these circumstances, a transport carrying valuables could plausibly be lost, abandoned, or buried under collapsed infrastructure, without creating a clear trail and surviving records. Post-war inquiries by Polish authorities collected testimonies from German railway workers, local residents, and former SS personnel. Some reference to heavily guarded train operating in early 1945. While others dismissed the story as a compilation of rumors born from the confusion of retreat. The lack of consistent documentation reflects the broader collapse of German administrative structures. Many records were burned, evacuated, or lost as Soviet forces advanced into Silesia. What remains is a combination of partial manifests, indirect reports, and fragmentary memories, none definitive on their own, yet collectively indicating abnormal transport activity in the region during the final phase of the war. The hypothesis that a train disappeared near the Owl Mountains gained strength as researchers examined the geography of the area. The railway line included several tunnels capable of being sealed with explosives, and wartime German engineering manuals document procedures for collapsing tunnel entrances to protect material or impede enemy forces. Such actions were executed in multiple locations during 19. Combined with the extensive underground works of Project Ries, the region provided numerous potential hiding places for abandoned or destroyed trains. Throughout the immediate post-war years, both Polish and Soviet military units conducted searches for hidden German depots. Reports describe the recovery of crates containing currency, personal items confiscated from civilians, and various military stores. These finds demonstrate that the German evacuation of Silesia included significant quantities of valuable material. However, no excavation produced evidence of a complete armored train buried intact. The absence of such evidence neither confirms nor disproves the train's existence. It reflects the sheer scale of wartime destruction, and the limited resources allocated to systematic archaeological searches. The narrative continued to develop due to the combination of missing documentation, eyewitness claims, and the known German practice of concentrating valuable goods for evacuation. As more archives opened in the late 20th century, historians re-examined transport records. Yet the central question whether a specific train containing gold and valuables vanished into a sealed tunnel, unresolved due to gaps in surviving evidence. Soviet forces pushed into Lower Silesia in early 19th. German authorities intensified the removal of valuables from the region. Railway junctions around Breslau, Waldenburg, and Hirschberg became critical evacuation points. The Reichsbahn operated under fragmented command structures at this stage of the war, but documentation shows that local GO offices, Wehrmacht transport officers, and SS administrative units coordinated the movement of state property, museum collections, industrial assets, and archival material toward Bavaria and Austria. These convoys were not unusual. Hundreds of trains left the collapsing eastern territories carrying government files, looted art, armaments, and industrial machinery. Within this broader logistical retreat, several eyewitness accounts from railway workers and local residents mentioned a heavily guarded train departing from the vicinity of Breslau in the final weeks of the war. These testimonies consistently refer to sealed wagons, armed SS personnel, and orders restricting access to the loading area. However, none of the accounts specify the exact nature of the cargo. What is known is that Lower Silesia contained numerous repositories for valuables evacuated earlier from Berlin, Kingsburg, and occupied territories. The region also held key branches of the Reichsbank auxiliary vaults and secure storage sites used by the SS Main Economic and Administrative Office, WV. These facilities handled currency reserves, foreign exchange, industrial bonds, gold, silver, and confiscated assets. German authorities routinely dispersed these holdings into smaller shipments as defeat approached, both to prevent capture and to maintain some form of economic continuity for an anticipated Alpine redoubt. It is within this complex pattern of evacuations that the so-called gold train legend later took shape. By mid-February 1945, the Wehrmacht prioritized military transports, but the SS possessed separate channels for moving sensitive material. Surviving German transport orders from this period reference special trains designated for Sirensweg. Security purposes, though, such phrasing was deliberately vague. The documentation does not identify gold shipments specifically. Nonetheless, it confirms that sealed trains with restricted manifests operated in Lower Silesia during the exact time frame associated with the gold train story. As the Red Army advanced into Silesia, many railway lines were cut or destroyed. Some trains were redirected, some abandoned, and others captured intact. Soviet military reports list large quantities of valuables recovered from railway cars in the region, including crates of currency, museum items, industrial assets, and metals, but none describe a single train, matching the later narrative of a fully loaded treasure convoy disappearing underground. The Wałbrzych area, where the legend would later be centered, did contain extensive rail infrastructure. This included tunnels, sidings, storage depots, and partially completed underground facilities connected to the Ries complex. These installations were part of broader dispersal efforts for industry and command centers, but their exact operational status in early 1945 remains only partially documented. German records from these final months are fragmented, and many were destroyed, contributing to the uncertainty that allowed the gold train narrative to grow after the war. Post-war, Polish security reports from 1945 and 1946 reference abandoned German rolling stock in the region, some of which contained valuable goods. However, none of these documents describe an armored treasure train. Inventories mention textiles, foodstuffs, machine tools, and government files. Soviet trophy brigades, responsible for collecting German property, also cataloged significant quantities of valuables recovered from Silesian mines, tunnels, and depots. But again, not a singular legendary train. The absence of definitive archival evidence does not negate the existence of valuable transports. It only indicates that none have been proven to match the later gold train narrative. The combination of missing records, destroyed manifests, chaotic late-war logistics, and extensive underground construction created an information vacuum. Into that vacuum, the legend took shape, built from fragments of real evacuations, real transports, and real losses of German material assets during the final collapse of the Third Reich. The search for the Nazi Gold train entered its most aggressive phase in January 19, when the German retreat accelerated and the Lower Silesian rail network collapsed under the pressure of Soviet advances. By this time, the evacuation orders from Breslau's Karl Henke demanded that cultural assets, archives, state reserves, and military documents be removed from the province before the Red Army reached the Oder. These orders created the conditions in which armored trains and sealed transports began moving westward in irregular patterns, often at night, escorted by Waffen-SS security units. Surviving Polish railway workers later reported several abnormal train formations on the line between Brest, Waldenburg, and Hirschberg, including trains that traveled without lights and bypassed standard signaling procedures. None of these movements were documented in German transport records, suggesting they were classified under the Emergency Reich Main Security Office system. The region around Wałbrzych, Waldenburg, became central because of its unique combination of railway tunnels, abandoned mine shafts, and large defensive construction sites belonging to the Ries complex. These environments created ideal conditions for hiding large objects rapidly. One location repeatedly mentioned in postwar testimonies was kilometer 65 on the Rocklo-Wałbrzych line, specifically the area near the disused siding that connected to the Fürstenstein KSI's tunnels. Several postwar interrogations, separately by Polish security services and American occupation officers, recorded that German railway personnel were ordered to vacate the area while SS engineers sealed part of the track with concrete. Although no railway log confirms these orders, the consistency of the testimonies supports the possibility that a classified train was diverted into a tunnel or side chamber and intentionally blocked out. Another relevant factor was the evacuation of the Breslau State Bank and the Silesian branch of the Reichsbank. Official documents confirmed that a portion of the financial reserves was loaded onto trucks and moved toward the Sudeten region. What remains unclear is whether all shipments reached their destinations. Several records disappear after the entries dated mid-January. These gaps coincide with the timeline in which the alleged armored train left Brest. Polish investigators in the late 1940s noted that the missing manifests listed both gold reserves and valuables taken from the Schlesier-Massome collections. None of those items have been recovered. The most important testimony came from a former German officer who, after the war, stated that an armored train carrying state property and cultural deposits was dispatched toward Waldenburg but never re-emerged from that sector. He claimed the SS intended to prevent the cargo from being captured and therefore diverted it into an unfinished tunnel associated with the Ries complex. Although the officer's statement does not identify the specific tunnel, it aligns with the strategic logic of the period. German command believed the Lower Silesian fortifications could hold long enough for a partial regrouping, making underground storage a viable temporary measure. When Soviet forces captured the region, they conducted extensive searches of the main tunnels at Asoka, Urzechka, and Wo. These inspections found construction materials, generators, ventilation equipment, and administrative papers, but no evidence of large repositories. However, Soviet reports are incomplete, with several pages missing from the archival files transferred to Polish custody decades later. This absence has fueled persistent speculation that the Red Army either removed the contents of a hidden train or that searches never extended into sealed side chambers. By the mid-1950s, Polish geological teams surveyed the area near kilometer 65 and identified anomalies consistent with man-made cavities, but the government lacked funds to pursue excavation. Later surveys in the 1970s indicated structural instability beneath portions of the embankment, suggesting either collapsed tunnels or filled shafts. None of these findings definitively confirm the existence of the train, yet each aligns with the hypothesis that a concealed underground structure may still exist. Despite the absence of physical proof, the pattern of wartime rail movements, missing inventories, consistent testimony, and geological irregularities has kept the subject active in historical research. What is certain is that several convoys carrying valuable assets departed Breslau in early night. What remains unresolved is whether one of them was intentionally buried in the Wałbrzych sector as the front collapsed, a possibility that still rests on the boundary between documented fact and unverified conclusion. The search for the Nazi gold train intensified after the collapse of the German defensive line along the Oder in early night. As Soviet forces advanced westward into Silesia, thousands of civilians and officials attempted to flee. Documentation from German construction offices in the region shows that railway tunnels, anti-aircraft shelters, and underground storage chambers had been used repeatedly in 1944 to hide archives and industrial equipment. Several Wehrmacht engineering units were also assigned to protect specific rail corridors between Breslau, Waldenburg, and Hirschberg. These records do not mention gold or valuables, but they confirm that rail traffic in the last months of the war included sealed wagons guarded by military police. When the Red Army captured Lower Silesia, it took control of railway depots, tunnels, and sidings. Soviet trophy brigades cataloged machinery, locomotives, and industrial stockpiles. reports survive describing trains loaded with textiles, copper, wire, medical supplies, and disassembled machinery evacuated from bombed German factories. None of these reports confirm the existence of a special armored train carrying gold. However, several Polish railway workers interviewed in the late 1940s described a military transport that passed through the Wałbrzych area shortly before the Soviet occupation. They claimed that the train was covered, guarded, and diverted onto a secondary track leading toward the Owl Mountains. These accounts are consistent in timing but inconsistent in detail. During 1945 and 1946, the new Polish administration conducted limited inspections of tunnels and bunkers in the region, especially those connected to Project Riese. Many of these structures were unfinished and contained only construction debris. A few held crates of documents and machine parts abandoned during the German withdrawal. No precious metals or valuables were found. Several tunnels had been deliberately collapsed, likely to prevent accidents or to conceal unfinished work. Polish engineers noted that some collapsed sections were too unstable to excavate with available equipment. Interest in the gold train resurfaced in the 1950s, when former German officials published memoirs claiming that valuables from Breslau's banks had been removed before the city fell. Archival evidence supports the evacuation of some financial assets, but it does not specify their final destination. The memoirs mention convoys and trucks, not trains. Polish intelligence at the time concluded that most claims about a hidden treasure train were unverified and speculative. Nevertheless, the idea persisted in regional folklore. In the 1960s and 1970s, historians studying Nazi economic administration documented large-scale transfers of gold and foreign currency from occupied territories to the Reichsbank in Berlin. As the war continued, these assets were moved further south into Bavaria and Austria. American forces later discovered and secured much of this material at the Merkers salt mine in The Merkers find is fully documented and accounted for, leaving no confirmed gap large enough to represent a missing train load of gold. In the early 1990s, the collapse of the Soviet Union opened new archives. Polish researchers examined Soviet military reports from the Lower Silesia campaign. These records include inventories of captured rolling stock, railway depots, and industrial facilities. None list a special train carrying precious metals. The Soviet units assigned to the area were focused on pursuing retreating German forces and securing transport routes, not on treasure extraction. Trophy brigades typically documented anything of strategic value. Their silence on a gold train is significant. Despite this, local legends continued to grow. Residents of Wałbrzych recounted stories of German officers using forced labor to clear tunnels shortly before the Soviet entry. Others described explosions heard in the hills, interpreted as deliberate tunnel demolitions. Some of these stories align with documented demolitions carried out to slow the Soviet advance. Others appear to merge wartime memories with later speculation. In 2015, renewed interest emerged when two treasure hunters claimed to have located the gold train using ground-penetrating radar. Their announcement drew global attention. Government geologists conducted an official survey of the indicated site near the 65th kilometer of the railway line between Wrocław and Wałbrzych. The results showed soil anomalies consistent with natural geological formations, not a buried train. Subsequent drilling confirmed the absence of man-made structures. Archaeologists concluded that the site contained no evidence of a tunnel or railway chamber. The 2015 investigation was the most technologically rigorous search ever undertaken for the gold train. Its negative findings strengthened the consensus among historians. There is no verified evidence that a train loaded with gold disappeared in Lower Silesia. What did occur, and is historically documented, were widespread evacuations of industrial equipment, financial records, and miscellaneous goods as German authorities attempted to delay the collapse of their military and economic system. These movements were chaotic, fragmented, and often poorly recorded, creating an environment in which legends could take root. Yet the gold train story remains part of the wartime landscape of Silesia, not because of confirmed discoveries, but because the region's final months were marked by destruction, secrecy, and the rapid disappearance of entire transport columns. In that environment, even ordinary military trains could easily be transformed by memory and rumor into the possibility of a hidden treasure convoy. Polish investigations, after 1945, attempted to trace the full network of Nazi gold movements across Silesia. Testimonies gathered from railway workers, forced laborers, and surviving German personnel repeatedly pointed to a pattern. The evacuation of armored trains toward the Lower Silesian mountains accelerated sharply in the final 10 months of the war. These reports included descriptions of sealed freight cars guarded by SS units, nighttime transfers, and orders issued directly from Gauleiters and district financial offices. However, none of these testimonies provided verifiable coordinates or physical evidence of the specific train later popularized as the gold train. The Polish security services of the early Cold War period conducted several classified surveys of the Wałbrzych region. Archival records confirm that between 1946 and 1949, Polish military engineers carried out limited tunnel inspections and geophysical measurements around the rail lines southwest of the city. These operations were constrained by unstable terrain, destroyed documentation, and the political priorities of the emerging communist state, which directed more resources toward reconstruction than archaeological recovery. None of the early searches resulted in confirmed discoveries. During the 1950s and 1960s, the area underwent significant restructuring. New rail infrastructure was built, disused tunnels were demolished or sealed, and mining activities altered the landscape. Several historical entry points that might have been relevant to wartime rail traffic were either removed or covered. This reconstruction era complicated later research, as investigators in the 21st century could no longer accurately match historical maps with modern topography. The subject resurfaced periodically in academic work. Polish and German historians studying the collapse of Nazi administrative networks noted that valuables from Breslau, Apilin, and Grilitz were indeed evacuated toward the Sudeten foothills. Financial transfers included currency reserves, precious metals, industrial assets, and seized private property. Some of these transports were intercepted by Soviet forces, others disappeared into the administrative chaos that accompanied the final retreat of German civilian and military authorities. Yet none of the archival cases matched the specific description of an armored, treasure-laden train entering a concealed tunnel system outside Wałbrzych. Technically, the existence of such a train would require several conditions: a functioning rail line able to carry heavy loads during late 1944 or early 19, a secure site protected from air reconnaissance, a tunnel or underground structure sufficiently reinforced for long-term storage, and evacuation orders issued by a district authority with access to large quantities of valuables. Archival evidence confirms that all these elements existed individually across Silesia. What remains unverified is their convergence into a single event. In 2015, ground-penetrating radar images obtained by private researchers reignited international attention. The scans displayed anomalies consistent with metallic objects and linear structures. However, subsequent surveys conducted by the Polish Geological Institute determined that the anomalies were most likely natural geological formations rather than buried rolling stock. The Institute's position was supported by additional magnetometric and resistivity analysis that showed no clear signatures of rail vehicles. As a result, the Polish government publicly closed the investigation. Modern scholarship considers the Nazi gold train a case study in the difficulties of reconstructing wartime logistics in regions altered by postwar redevelopment. While numerous Nazi transports vanished during including documented convoys of industrial equipment, cultural property, and currency, the evidence for a single treasure train outside Wałbrzych remains inconclusive. Primary sources lack precise coordinates, material traces have not been detected, and independent studies have not produced verifiable data. Nevertheless, researchers continue to examine regional archives, Wehrmacht engineering records, and civilian evacuation orders. These efforts aim to trace the broader network of Nazi asset movements rather than to validate a specific legend. Contemporary historians emphasize that the value of the investigation lies not in the prospect of hidden treasure, but in understanding the administrative collapse of a state attempting to relocate resources while its infrastructure disintegrated under military pressure. Ultimately, the Nazi gold train remains an unresolved historical question. It occupies a space between documented patterns of wartime asset relocation and the absence of physical evidence, connecting those patterns to a single missing train. Its significance lies less in the search itself and more in what the case reveals about the fragmented final months of the Third Reich and the challenges of interpreting incomplete wartime records.